Danger at Diablo, Chapter 12. The Trap Springs. It was the middle of the morning when Dude Rango, in a travel-stained pair of jeans and a clean but worn hickory shirt, came clattering down the middle of Diablo's main street. He was riding a tired brown horse and leading a burro that was loaded down with an assortment of mining tools. The pick and shovel and the thin sheet iron pan were trademarks of the prospector he was impersonating. John Shanley was conveniently on hand in front of his land office to greet the stranger with a show of surprise and interest. He hurried him inside, and the door closed quickly after them. Those who were near at the moment, and there were several citizens with an eye out for news, noticed that the stranger was carrying a small sack which showed suspicious sharp bulges. It must have been quartz samples he brought, they agreed later, but at the moment they were only mildly interested and wondered what all the hurry was about. The stranger stayed a long time in Shanley's office, and the gossips soon lost interest and went on about more pressing business. If they had continued to watch, they would have seen Shanley leave his office after a while to go up the street to the jail, and they would have seen him stroll back very casually with Sheriff Luke at his side. Both men entered the office, and again the door was closed tight. Back at the sheriff's office, Lofty Craig gloomily took over. He had had no luck last evening trying to track the fugitive, and he was a little disturbed that John Shanley had been so mysterious when he came to get Sheriff Luke just now. Lofty had been getting quite a few black looks from the local folks lately because of the jailbreak and the robbery at Ben Crane's mine. If he could have caught up with Ruth Horton last night, it would have done a lot for his standing. Even the waitress over at the hotel didn't bring meals to him anymore. She was annoyed with him and wouldn't even talk to him, since he had been forced to confess that the dinner she cooked for him had been served to Ruth Horton instead. On the whole, Lofty was feeling pretty low as he stared out the window onto the hot, dusty street. He wondered what was going on down at the land office. Sheriff Luke would tell him, he felt sure. But Luke didn't give Lofty any explanations when he returned from that closed-door conference at Shanley's. He seemed excited, but not worried. He was in very good spirits and joked more than he had for many weeks. But even though Lofty hinted broadly and did everything but come out and ask what was going on, Luke made no effort to explain. It was just as Luke was locking up the back door of the empty jail and getting ready to close up for the night that he gave Lofty any kind of a hint as to what had been discussed. "I'm pulling out early in the morning from the ranch," he told Lofty. "I'll leave you in charge." "You going to the Capitol?" Lofty asked. Sheriff Luke smiled and shook his head. "Nope. Headed the other way, as it happens. Got some business to tend to." "Yeah?" Lofty encouraged him. "Private business," Sheriff Luke grinned. "Can't tell you right now, but you'll hear all about it in time." And that was all he would say. Lofty was disturbed. In the last 2 years that he had been deputy, he couldn't remember another time when Sheriff McTavish had been mysterious about anything. He usually made it a point to tell Lofty exactly where he was going and what it was about. Lofty agreed rather gloomily to stay on the job and take care of anything that came up. He had an idea that, as usual, his only activity would be to quiet some miner who felt like celebrating. Sheriff Luke rode off to the ranch in an unusually cheerful mood. He was full of fun all evening and kept Tag entertained with all sorts of yarns. Annie was relieved and happy to see him so relaxed. He seemed to have shaken off the gloomy mood that had held him ever since their arrival. He didn't make any explanation, but he dropped a hint now and then during supper, and later as they sat in front of the crackling fire, that he had a very good reason for being cheerful. Annie waited to hear the secret of his changed outlook, but bedtime came and he still made no explanation. "He's so much like Tag," she thought affectionately as she prepared for bed, "with his big secret. I bet he won't be able to keep it through breakfast." But it was still long before the usual rising time when Annie sat up in bed and listened. She was positive that someone was moving around out in the barn. One of the horses was stamping and snorting. She pulled a heavy flannel wrapper over her long-sleeved nightgown and put on her bedroom slippers. The snorting was still going on out there. She reached for her six-shooter and in the darkness made sure that it was fully loaded. Then she quietly left the room and made for the kitchen door, pistol in hand. In the dark kitchen, she was crossing to the door when she heard a slight sound behind her. She whirled, stepping back against the wall away from the window so she would not be outlined against the grayness of the early dawn. "I've got a gun and it's pointed at you," she said in a quiet tone. "Whoever you are, better reach for the ceiling." "It's me, Annie." It was a shaky, small voice. She lowered the Colt. "Tag Oakley, what are you prowling around for this time of night?" "I heard you go by my room just now," he whispered, coming to her. "Is something wrong?" "Sounds like it in the barn," she answered in the same quiet tone. "Keep your voice down so we don't wake up Uncle Luke. It may just be a rat that's got the horses upset, but I aim to find out." "Can I come?" Tag held her sleeve tightly. "I suppose so," she answered, "but keep back of me, and if I run into that horse thief or any other trouble his size, you scoot back up here and wake up Uncle Luke." "Sure, Annie." Tag was delighted at being included in the war party. Annie moved quickly out of the back door, her Colt cocked and ready, and Tag started after her. He stopped only long enough to pick up the heavy iron poker that stood beside the old fireplace. He had no intention of running away if Annie bumped into trouble. He was going to stand his ground right beside her. She stopped in the doorway of the big barn and stared in surprise. Uncle Luke was saddling his gray by the light of a shaded oil lantern. "Uncle Luke?" She lowered the Colt and carefully uncocked it. "I thought you were somebody trying to steal the horses." Luke McTavish looked uncomfortable. Hi there, young'uns," he said. "Sorry I got you up. I've got an errand to tend to, and I thought I'd get going without waking you." He slapped the gray horse, half playfully. "This fellow thought he'd rather sleep and kicked up a fuss." "I'm glad he did," Annie said, "or you'd have started out without a bite of breakfast." She laughed. "And we don't allow that in this high-class boarding house. I'm going right straight in and whip up a batch of flapjacks and a pot of coffee." She turned to go. "No, wait, honey." Sheriff Luke spoke hastily. "I don't have time. I've got some bread and cheese in my saddlebags and a canteen full of our good well water. That's all I need for breakfast this morning." "What difference will half an hour make?" Annie was a little surprised at her usually hungry uncle. "I'm meeting a feller up the road a piece." Luke was already leading the gray outside the barn. "And I don't want to keep him waiting." "Why don't we invite him to eat too?" Tag was curious to see who it was. "No," his uncle brushed it aside. "Not this morning. We're in a hurry." When he was mounted, he looked down at the pair. Annie was standing beside Tag, her arm over the boy's shoulder, and they were both looking up at him with puzzled curiosity. He frowned. "I know you're busting to know what this is all about," he said gravely, "but you'll have to wait a bit. You'll hear soon enough, though I can't say just when. Maybe a day or two, maybe longer. And Annie," he leaned over to touch her shoulder, "when it comes to trips to Paris and all the rest of it, maybe you'll be having them too before long. Might be some changes around here for all of us." Before either of them could answer, he had started up the big gray and was cantering off. "What was Uncle Luke talking about?" Tag's small face was puzzled. Annie shook her head, unsmiling. "I don't know, Button," she said, turning him back toward the house and keeping her arm protectively over his shoulder. "But somehow I'm worried. It isn't like him to be so mysterious." "Wonder who it is he's meeting," Tag persisted. "We'll know when he gets back and is ready to tell us. Meantime, let's get ourselves some of those hotcakes he didn't want. There's a new jug of molasses just aching to be used." All through the long morning, Annie battled a feeling that she couldn't quite put a name to. She felt as if something was hanging over her, something unpleasant. It was the same sensation she had often had just before a thunderstorm, when the whole sky turned a strange yellow and the wind died down and everything was still, very still. Then the thunder would start, very faint at first and far away, then louder and louder, and the lightning flashes would light up the sky and come closer and closer, till finally the rain would come sweeping down and drench the whole place. When it came, there was never any telling how long it would last or what damage it would do, but there was no way of putting it off or of stopping it once it started, and she had the same strange feeling today that something was going to happen and there was nothing she could do to stop it. It was still early in the afternoon when she decided to saddle Target and ride into town to talk to Lofty Craig. She was hoping that, without telling him what was worrying her, she could get some reassurance that everything was all right. Tag wanted to go with her, but she convinced him that someone should stay here and keep an eye out for Rufe Horton in case he sneaked back. She made the boy promise not to interfere with the bad man if he did show up, but to keep out of his way, and then ride after her the moment Horton left. She felt that they had scared him off earlier, and he might come back a second time for whatever he was looking for. She was careful to leave her uncle's bedroom in perfect order so they would know if anything had been disturbed. Tag was excited at being entrusted with such an important job like this. He took up his post in the comfortable crotch of the big cottonwood tree that stood in the front yard. From his perch there, he could see in all directions around the ranch house. He was well fortified with thick slices of Annie's fresh homemade bread, slathered with butter right out of the churn, and 2 pocketfuls of ginger snaps, the store-boughten kind that were his favorite. Annie waved back as she started Target through the gate, though she couldn't see Tag up in the tree. Then she gave the horse free rein and headed for Diablo. She felt that all she needed to put her mind at ease was a few words with Lofty. She was quite certain that Luke must have given his deputy a great deal more information about his trip away from Diablo than he had offered her. But Lofty, who was still nursing hurt feelings over being shut out of Luke's confidence, was sulky and not inclined to unbend. He neither admitted that he knew where her uncle had gone, nor that he didn't. She was leaving the sheriff's office when she heard 3 shots in rapid succession. It was the old pioneer signal for help, the one she had once used outside the Smoke Tree Station when she and Tag were in danger of being shut out. Somebody was in trouble. Half the town was in the street waiting by the time the fast galloping rider had pulled to a stop in the middle of the street, swayed a moment in his saddle, then tumbled off into the dust, apparently unconscious. Annie got to him first and saw that the man was a stranger to her. His left sleeve was caked with blood, and his shirt clung wetly to him as if he had been riding hard and long. The horse, panting hard, stood drooping and exhausted. By the time others had run up, Annie had made a quick inspection of his arm and seen that it was only a slight flesh wound. She suggested that they carry the wounded man into the sheriff's office and call Doc Busby. But as they started to lift him, he sat up and pushed them away, staring around wildly. "Shanley," he croaked. "Bring John Shanley here." The storekeeper ran down the street, yelling for Shanley, who promptly appeared in his doorway and came running with his long coat-tails flying out behind him. The stranger was on his feet, swaying and clutching his arm as Shanley came up. Shanley took one look at his face. "Good heavens, Mr. Rango!" He grabbed the wounded man by his good arm. "Speak up, man! What happened? Where's Luke McTavish?" Rango seemed on the verge of collapse as he answered between groans, but loud enough for everyone within a radius of 10 feet to hear. "McTavish shot me." "Luke shot you?" John Shanley almost shouted the words. He shook Rango roughly. "Why? What are you saying?" Rango steadied himself on his feet and faced Shanley. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Annie and Lofty, both of them suspicious and alert. He had better make a convincing story out of this. He paused dramatically. Then, with a very good imitation of anger, he told Shanley loudly, "He tricked you, Shanley. He had his gang ambush us halfway to Jump Off. He got away with every cent of your money, and he tried to kill me." Well, and that's the end of chapter 12. Come back next time to find out what happens next.